Athens, the city that gave us democracy, philosophy, theater, and the kind of self-congratulation that still echoes in classrooms today. We're told this was the cradle of freedom, where citizens debated laws, voted in assemblies, and laid the foundations of Western civilization. But here's the trick. For every free man raising his hand in the assembly, there were 2 enslaved people who had no hands to raise, no voice to speak, no name worth recording. Behind the marble columns and lofty speeches of liberty was a system greased with chains. Slaves mined the silver that funded Athens' fleets, tilled the fields that fed its philosophers, and served in the households of men who wrote endlessly about justice, while never questioning why half their city wore shackles. This is the comedy of history, the grotesque joke. Democracy, that proud invention of Athens, was never meant for everyone. In fact, it only existed because the majority were excluded. Women, foreigners, and above all, slaves, were the silent foundation beneath the rhetoric of freedom. Today, we peel back the marble mask. We look at Athens not as the birthplace of liberty, but as the empire of hypocrisy, where democracy was built on the debt of chains. When people today speak of democracy, they often trace its roots back to Athens. The shining city on the Acropolis, crowned by the Parthenon, has become a symbol of liberty, philosophy, and political participation. Tour guides and textbooks alike praise Athens as the birthplace of freedom. But peel back the marble facade, and another truth emerges. Athens' democracy was built on exclusion, on inequality, and most of all, on chains. In the 5th century BCE, at the height of Athens' power, the city proclaimed itself the model of self-rule. Citizens gathered in the assembly to debate laws, vote on war, and even hold their leaders accountable. Yet who were these citizens? Adult men born to Athenian parents, numbering perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 in a population of several hundred thousand. Women, foreigners, and slaves were denied the rights of citizenship, and slaves alone may have numbered between 80,000 and 120,000, far more than the so-called citizen body that prided itself on liberty. Here lies the first satirical twist. A society famous for inventing freedom relied on the unfreedom of most of its people. The Athenians congratulated themselves on isonomia, equality under the law. But that equality applied to only a narrow slice of the population. To be a citizen was to stand above women, above medics, foreigners, and above slaves. The citizen's liberty was purchased by denying liberty to others. Even the word democracy, demos, people, kratos, turned power, was defined by exclusion. The people meant citizens, not all humans. The irony thickens when we turn to Athens' cultural achievements. Philosophers debated virtue, playwrights staged tragedies about justice and hubris, and poets sang of liberty. Yet these cultural wonders existed only because a massive labor force toiled invisibly in fields, households, workshops, and mines. While Socrates questioned Athenian values in the agora, enslaved workers cut the stones for the very buildings where those values were debated. It was not lost on some ancient observers. Critics in other Greek states mocked Athens as a place where freedom was shouted from the rooftops, while chains rattled in the basements. But within Athens itself, this contradiction was normalized. Slavery was considered natural, an unquestioned fact of life. Democracy was possible only because slaves absorbed the burdens of labor. The image of Athens as a school of Hellas, as Thucydides described it, rests on an uncomfortable truth. Athens was also a marketplace of flesh. Captives from war, victims of piracy, and children sold by impoverished families ended up on Athenian auction blocks. For every lofty speech in the assembly, there were slaves sweeping its floors, serving its members, and recording its decisions. Slaves who would never cast a vote themselves. This illusion of liberty, the idea that Athens was a beacon of freedom, remains powerful even today. We praise the Parthenon's beauty without mentioning the hands that carved its marble. We celebrate Pericles' funeral oration without pausing to ask who built the walls, who cooked the food, who mined the silver that funded the empire. To the Athenians, none of this was hypocrisy. It was order. They believed that freedom for some required subjugation of others. The citizen's dignity was inseparable from the slave's humiliation. And so Athens became the paradox we inherit, the birthplace of democracy, and at the same time, a society where freedom rested on chains. This is the illusion we must confront at the start of our story. Athens may have called itself free, but freedom that exists only for a few is not freedom at all. It is privilege, masquerading as liberty. And that illusion, dressed in marble and philosophy, became one of the greatest deceptions in human history. If Chapter 1 revealed the illusion of liberty, then Chapter 2 pulls us down into the engine room of Athenian society, the machinery of slavery that powered every shining claim of freedom. Athens did not stumble into slavery, it perfected it. Historians estimate that, in classical Athens, slaves may have outnumbered citizens 2 to 1. Some lived in wealthy households, attending to cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Others labored in workshops, producing pottery, armor, and textiles. But the harshest fate awaited those sent to the mines, particularly the silver mines at Laurion, southeast of Athens. There, slaves worked in suffocating tunnels, hacking rock in darkness, often chained, sometimes children small enough to squeeze into spaces adults could not. The silver they extracted funded Athens' fleet of triremes, which in turn defended freedom at sea. The irony could not be sharper. The freedom of the citizen sailor rowing on the deck was bought by the chains of the slave beneath the earth. In domestic life, slaves were everywhere. A wealthy Athenian household might have 10, 20, or even 50 enslaved people. Some women served as attendants, spinning wool, preparing food, and guarding the family's women. Others were purchased as wet nurses, raising children who would one day call themselves defenders of liberty. Male slaves might accompany their masters to the agora, carrying loads, or serve as tutors to young boys. Their visibility was constant, their voices absent. One could walk through Athens' marble streets, admire the painted temples, and never notice the hands that swept the dust away. The machinery of slavery worked best when it became invisible. Athens prided itself on craftsmanship, the red figure pottery, the bronze statues, the weapons that armed hoplites. Yet many of these were produced not by citizens, but by enslaved laborers working in workshops called ergasteria. Some were skilled artisans, forced to produce beauty without ever owning what they made. Their output filled markets and fueled trade, while their lives remained ledger entries in their masters' accounts. Here again the satire emerges. Athens exalted the idea of the independent craftsman, yet most independent production depended on those who had no independence at all. Not all slaves belonged to individuals. The state itself owned slaves who served as public workers. Some acted as clerks, scribes, or attendants in official buildings. Famously, Athens employed Scythian archers, a corps of publicly owned slaves tasked with keeping order in the assembly and marketplace. Imagine it. The very space where citizens proclaimed equality and freedom was policed by enslaved men armed with bows. The burden of slavery weighed doubly on women. Enslaved women often faced sexual exploitation, both in households and in state-regulated brothels. Some bore children who themselves became property, their humanity reduced to economic calculation. For these women, liberty was not only denied, it was mocked. Athens, the city of poets, made little room for poems about them. How did Athenians justify this system while praising liberty? They wrapped it in philosophy. Aristotle famously argued that some people were slaves by nature, destined to serve. To him, slavery was not an aberration, but a pillar of social order. His teacher, Plato, imagined ideal societies in his dialogues, but never questioned slavery as an institution. These intellectual giants, celebrated for their wisdom, could envision the cosmos, yet failed to imagine freedom for all. It is here that satire sharpens into tragedy. The same Athens that gave the world philosophy also gave it philosophical defenses of bondage. The paradox was not accidental, it was essential. Democracy required citizens to have leisure, and leisure required others to do the labor. Athens' democracy was loud in its pride, but quiet in its dependence. Citizens boasted of their rights, yet those rights dissolved if one fell into debt or captivity. The line between citizen and slave was not only one of law, but of fortune. And this fear, that liberty could be lost in a single moment, haunted Athenian society. It is why they needed slaves to remain invisible, voiceless, faceless. To look too closely at the machinery was to risk shattering the illusion of freedom. This was the machinery of Athens: mines that bled silver, households that hummed with unpaid labor, workshops that turned sweat into beauty, and philosophers who called it all natural. It was not a side note to democracy, it was its foundation. And so, when we look at the shining marble of the Parthenon today, we must also see the shadow it casts, a shadow shaped by chains. Athens called itself the birthplace of democracy, but who was allowed to step inside that circle of freedom? The answer reveals the paradox at the heart of Greek liberty. Freedom for some, chains for many. To be a citizen in Athens was to enjoy privileges unheard of in most of the ancient world: the right to vote in the assembly, to hold office, to speak in court, to own land, and to serve in the army as equals. But this equality was carefully rationed. Only free-born men with two citizen parents could claim the title. Women were excluded. Foreigners, medics, even if they lived their whole lives in Athens, were excluded. And of course, the enslaved, the very backbone of society, were not just excluded, but defined as property. The circle of liberty was drawn so tightly that the majority of Athens' population lived outside of it. Historians estimate that of perhaps 250,000 inhabitants in classical Athens, fewer than 40,000 were full citizens. In other words, Athenian democracy was the rule of the minority, built on the labor of the silenced majority. The freedom of the citizen existed in stark contrast to the unfreedom of others. An Athenian man's identity as a free citizen was constantly reinforced by what he was not. He was not a woman confined to the home. He was not a foreigner dependent on patronage, and he was not a slave in chains. Freedom in Athens was not universal but comparative. To know you were free, you had to see others who were not. Athenians gathered proudly in the assembly, raising hands to vote on war, taxes, and laws. Orators boasted that all citizens had an equal voice. Yet the very space of the assembly was cleansed of women, foreigners, and slaves. Decisions that shaped the lives of hundreds of thousands were made by a minority who congratulated themselves for their fairness. Here lies the biting irony. Athens gave the world democracy, but practiced it as oligarchy in disguise. The philosophers who praised equality rarely meant equality for all. Their demos was never universal. It was a club. Even though they were excluded, slaves were never absent. Public slaves policed the assembly, ensuring order among the citizens. Enslaved scribes recorded decrees. Enslaved craftsmen maintained the city's infrastructure. In this way, slaves became paradoxically central to political life. They made democracy possible while being denied its existence. Imagine it. The birth of democracy guarded by men in chains, its laws written by hands that could never benefit from them. Satire could hardly invent a sharper punchline. Athens wrapped this paradox in intellectual justification. Aristotle insisted that slavery was natural, that some people lacked the rational capacity for freedom. Plato, though critical of politics, never questioned slavery's role in society. The brightest minds of the polis could imagine ideal states, cosmic truths, and eternal forms, but they could not imagine a democracy without chains. It was not ignorance, it was convenience. Philosophy, like politics, rested on the labor of the enslaved, and so even the pursuit of truth was chained. The paradox stretched beyond Athens itself. The wealth that funded democracy often came from conquest. Tribute poured in from subject states of the Delian League. Athens' democracy thrived on imperial dominance, which meant enslaving and extracting from others outside its borders. Athenian citizens, when they voted for war, were voting to expand not just liberty, but slavery. This created an empire that called itself free, while tightening chains around others. To be Athenian was to be free, because others were not. And yet, Athenians knew how fragile this liberty was. A citizen could fall into debt, be captured in war, or be sold into slavery abroad. Freedom was not permanent. It was conditional, contingent on fortune. The line between citizen and slave was thinner than citizens like to admit. This fear haunted the polis, feeding both its paranoia and its dependence on enslaved labor to secure leisure for the citizen class. This was the paradox of Athens, a city that proclaimed liberty while enforcing exclusion, that praised equality while practicing hierarchy, that defined freedom by chaining others. It wasn't a flaw in the system, it was the system. And the bitter legacy of that paradox is that democracy itself, in its very origins, carried chains in its shadow. Athens tried to write its slaves into silence. Citizens debated in the assembly. Philosophers spoke in the agora. Poets sang of gods and heroes. And in all of this, the enslaved were footnotes. Yet silence is never empty. Beneath the hum of democracy, there were murmurs of resistance, gestures of defiance, and moments when the voiceless made themselves heard. Slavery in Athens was not a monolith. Some slaves worked in households, others in workshops, others in the deadly silver mines of Laurion. Some were highly skilled scribes or tutors, others were chained in fields. But across these worlds, a quiet resistance existed. Slaves slowed their work, broke tools, feigned illness. Small acts, invisible to historians' ledgers, but meaningful in a system that demanded total submission. A whispered insult, a stolen scrap of bread, a delayed order. These were rebellions too. Not dramatic enough for chronicles, but enough to assert the truth. Slaves were people, not tools. Some acts were louder. Escaped slaves fled into the hills of Attica or vanished into the chaos of war. Some became bandits, haunting the countryside, their very existence a reminder that chains could break. Athens feared these runaways not only because they cost money, but because they shattered the illusion that slavery was permanent. Stories tell of groups of fugitive slaves who gathered together, surviving by raiding farms or slipping into sympathetic communities. They were hunted relentlessly, but their shadows haunted the imagination of masters. Every unlocked door was a risk, every gathering of slaves a potential conspiracy. Slaves appeared in comedies and tragedies, but not as full people. Aristophanes mocked them for laughs. Playwrights cast them as servants, plot devices, or fools. Yet in these caricatures, fragments of real humanity surfaced. Their jokes hinted at knowledge, their laments echoed real suffering. Even in satire, the enslaved could not be erased. Simple graffiti, scratched into walls by hands that were never supposed to leave a mark, revealed names, prayers, small declarations of existence. A slave writing his name into stone was, in its way, a rebellion. I am here. I exist. While Athens itself saw no Spartacus-scale uprising, the wider Greek world did. In Chios, Naxos, and other slave-heavy islands, revolts broke out, though often crushed quickly. The sheer fear of revolt shaped policy. Slave patrols, public slaves who policed citizens, were themselves a paradox. Chained men ordered to keep other chained men in check. The very fact that revolts could happen proved that the enslaved never accepted their fate quietly. Athens prided itself on freedom of speech, Parrhesia, yet it feared the speech of the enslaved. Masters worried about slaves overhearing secrets in the symposium, about them whispering rumors, about them conspiring in the kitchen. The city proclaimed liberty for citizens while living in paranoia of those it had silenced. In courts, a slave's testimony was considered unreliable unless extracted under torture. An extraordinary paradox. The democracy trusted chains and whips more than human words. If freedom meant speech, then slavery meant enforced silence. And yet, the more Athens silenced its slaves, the louder history has made their absence feel. Resistance was not only defiance, but endurance. Every canal dug, every stone lifted, every household task completed. Each was done by people who endured because they had no choice. That endurance, too, was a form of survival. It was the quiet rebellion of living on in a world determined to erase you. The humanity of the enslaved is the peace democracy tried to delete. Athens wanted posterity to remember Pericles' speeches, not the cries from the mines. Yet without the mines, there would have been no Parthenon. Without the kitchens, there would have been no symposiums. Without the fields, there would have been no leisure for citizens to vote in the assembly. The paradox is stark. Athens called itself free, yet it lived in fear of the unfree. It tried to silence them, yet their shadows remain. Every whisper of resistance, every act of defiance, every step of endurance tells us that even when chains bind the body, the spirit strains against them. The enslaved were not voiceless. Their voices were stolen, but the echoes still reach us. Athens' golden age is celebrated in history books as the height of art, philosophy, and democracy. The Parthenon glowed on the Acropolis. Dramas of Sophocles and Euripides shook the theaters. Socrates questioned truth itself. Yet behind this brilliance was an engine Athens rarely admitted: slavery. Every marble column, every play, every naval victory was bought at the cost of chains. Athens' democracy was fueled, quite literally, by silver. In the rocky hills of Laurion, tens of thousands of enslaved laborers worked in dark, suffocating tunnels. They scraped ore from the earth with bare hands, hauling heavy loads through shafts where a citizen would not dare to crawl. Many never saw sunlight again. Their labor produced the coins that paid Athens' soldiers and funded the great temples. Citizens spoke of democracy as a miracle, but that miracle was minted from blood. The irony was almost satirical. A system that celebrated freedom was bankrolled by those who had none. Athens' naval supremacy, its triremes slicing across the Aegean, was a point of pride. But maintaining ships demanded an army of unfree hands. Slaves felled the timber, built the hulls, and rowed the galleys alongside poor citizens. Some captives from wars were forced into naval service, chained to benches where their sweat powered Athenian victories. When Pericles boasted that Athens was the school of Greece, he omitted the fact that its lessons in empire were written in oar strokes and whiplashes. War was both a risk and a harvest. Every Athenian victory brought home not just spoils of gold, but captives to be sold in the markets. Women and children from defeated cities became domestic slaves, farmhands or concubines. Men became labor in mines or fodder for resale. Every triumph added new links to Athens' chain economy. The Peloponnesian War, which would ultimately break Athens, also expanded its slave population. Every city sacked, every island subdued, every revolt crushed. Each became an opportunity to stock the markets. The Golden Age is remembered for beauty and thought. Yet artists, dramatists, and philosophers worked in a society where leisure was subsidized by slavery. Athenian citizens had time to attend plays because others worked their fields. They had the freedom to philosophize in the agora because someone else, enslaved, was grinding their grain. Even Aristotle, who later systematized much of Western philosophy, rationalized slavery as natural, claiming some were slaves by nature. The brilliance of Greek thought could question gods, politics, and existence, but rarely chains. That silence remains one of history's sharpest ironies. Athens prided itself on freedom, eleutheria. Citizens celebrated the right to speak, to vote, to challenge leaders. But this freedom was made possible only because a class of unfree people absorbed the burdens of survival. Freedom was rationed, subsidized by bondage. In this lies the cruel satire. Athens believed it had built the world's first democracy, but it was a democracy with conditions. Freedom for the few, silence for the many. The school of Greece taught liberty, but only for citizens who could afford it. Every coin stamped with Athena's owl carried the weight of the mines. Every play in the theater of Dionysus echoed with the silence of unseen workers. Every temple stone on the Acropolis was lifted by hands that would never pray inside. The cost of glory was not only measured in wars lost or cities destroyed, but in lives forgotten, buried in tunnels, lost at sea, erased in ledgers. Athens' golden age glittered brightly, but it glittered on the backs of those who were not allowed to shine. Athens' golden age could not last forever. Glory is expensive, and the Peloponnesian War drained more than Athens' coffers. It drained its illusion of invincibility. As the city weakened, so too did the fragile balance that kept its democracy alive. And once again, it was the enslaved who bore the heaviest cost: the Peloponnesian War and the exploitation of captives. When Athens clashed with Sparta and its allies, every battle created captives. Prisoners of war were auctioned off across the Aegean, swelling slave markets. Entire populations of conquered cities, men, women, children, were uprooted and sold. For the victors, slavery was profit. For the vanquished, it was obliteration. The enslaved became pawns in a brutal chess game, currency for ransoms, bargaining chips in diplomacy, or fodder for Athens' ever-hungry labor needs. War was not only fought for honor or survival, it was fought for bodies to feed the machine. The Sicilian expedition, disaster and chains. In 415 BCE, Athens launched its ill-fated Sicilian expedition. What began as ambition ended in catastrophe. Tens of thousands of Athenian soldiers and sailors perished, but those who survived faced enslavement in foreign quarries. Athens' own citizens, once free, found themselves breaking rocks in Syracuse, indistinguishable from the captives they had once purchased. The satire of empire had flipped. A democracy built on slavery now saw its own people in chains. Decline and revolt. As war dragged on, the enslaved population itself became restless. In moments of crisis, some slaves escaped to enemy lines. Others rebelled in small but significant ways. Every revolt reminded Athens that its wealth and freedom rested on a foundation it could never fully control. Meanwhile, citizens debated politics in the assembly, but fewer and fewer Athenians could ignore the irony. The more Athens fought for supremacy, the more it resembled the tyranny it claimed to despise, the end of empire. When Sparta, aided by Persia, finally broke Athens in 404 BCE, the Parthenon still gleamed on the Acropolis, but the city's power was shattered. The democracy survived, but diminished. Athens had lost its empire, its navy, and much of its wealth. For the enslaved, defeat meant little improvement. They were still trapped in mines, fields, and households, their lives erased from triumphs and tragedies alike. If anything, Athens' desperation and decline hardened its reliance on their labor, philosophy, and the silence of chains. Even in decline, Athens produced thinkers whose words endure to this day. Plato, student of Socrates, imagined ideal republics. Aristotle, student of Plato, dissected ethics and politics. Yet when it came to slavery, both men largely accepted it as natural, inevitable, unquestionable. The paradox deepened. A civilization celebrated for questioning everything failed to question its own foundations. It could doubt the gods, but not the chains. The bitter legacy. By the time Alexander the Great rose in the 4th century BCE, Athens was no longer the dominant power of Greece. But its cultural legacy endured. Plays, temples, philosophies, and politics spread across the Mediterranean. And embedded in that legacy, unspoken but undeniable, was the reality that freedom had always been rationed. Athens taught the world democracy, but it also taught the world how easily democracy could be built on exclusions, how the word citizen could shine only if someone else was made invisible. The satirical endnote. The tragedy of Athens is that its brilliance still dazzles, even as its shadows are forgotten. History books praise its democracy, but rarely its minds. They admire its philosophy, but rarely its silence on chains. This is the final irony. Athens is remembered as the birthplace of freedom, while the unfree who carried its weight have no names. Athens fell, but its ideals lived on. Yet those ideals, liberty, reason, beauty, were always entangled with slavery. The fate of the enslaved in Athens' decline is a warning that freedom without universality is fragile. A democracy that excludes is not a democracy at all, but an empire with a mask. Athens may have declined, but its ideas and its contradictions echoed far beyond the Aegean. Rome would inherit not only Greek culture, but also its dependency on unfree labor. And the rest of the world, centuries later, would still debate whether the brilliance of Western civilization was built on chains. Rome learns from Greece. When Rome conquered Greece in the 2nd century BCE, it absorbed Greek art, philosophy, and literature. Roman elites sent their children to study Homer and Aristotle, decorated their villas with Greek statues, and debated politics in assemblies modeled on Athenian precedent. But Rome also inherited Greece's acceptance of slavery. Greek tutors taught Roman boys, Greek doctors healed Roman wounds, and Greek philosophers entertained Roman salons. Yet many of those teachers were enslaved captives, dragged to Italy after Greece's fall. The culture that once celebrated freedom now trained another empire while still chained, scaling up the system. If Greece normalized slavery, Rome industrialized it. Where Athens relied on tens of thousands of slaves, Rome relied on millions. Entire estates, latifundia, were worked by enslaved labor. Mines and quarries swallowed lives by the thousands. Gladiatorial arenas turned human suffering into public spectacle. Athens had pioneered democracy for the few, supported by the labor of the many. Rome took the same formula and built an empire, philosophy's inheritance. Greek philosophy, carried into Rome, continued to wrestle with justice, law, and virtue, while mostly ignoring the lives of the enslaved. Aristotle's arguments about natural slaves were cited by Roman writers as justification for conquest. Stoics like Seneca admitted that masters should treat slaves with some humanity, but they still accepted slavery as unavoidable. The same silence that haunted Athens now became Rome's rhetoric. Freedom as a noble ideal, slavery as an unspoken necessity. The slave revolts. Yet the legacy of Greece also inspired resistance. If Athens had its contradictions, Rome had its Spartacus. The famous gladiators' rebellion in 73 BCE carried echoes of the Zanj centuries later, and even of Athens' own forgotten enslaved. When Spartacus marched, he did not just fight Rome. He challenged the centuries of Greek and Roman logic that said chains were permanent. His defeat was brutal, but his memory became immortal. The satirical thread. History textbooks often celebrate the continuity between Greece and Rome: philosophy, politics, art. But the satire is sharper than the marble. Both empires wrapped themselves in ideals of liberty while perfecting systems of bondage. Both exalted citizenship while denying personhood to the majority of their populations. Athens invented the idea. Rome mass-produced it, and the rest of history inherited the contradiction, echoes in later empires. From Rome, the Greek model of freedom on slave backs traveled through Europe and into colonial powers. The Enlightenment philosophers who admired Athens praised its rationality and liberty, but often ignored its mines and markets. Later, when slavery became the backbone of the transatlantic world, defenders of the trade cited Aristotle as intellectual armor. The ghosts of Athens whispered across oceans. The bitter legacy. In the end, Greece left the world a paradox, the dream of democracy and the reality of chains. Its legacy shaped empires that rose and fell for centuries. Rome expanded it. Europe reinterpreted it. Modern nations still grapple with it. Every time democracy is praised without asking who is excluded, Athens lingers in the background. Every time freedom is celebrated while inequality thrives, the irony of Greece's foundation resurfaces. Closing narrative for Chapter 7. Athens gave the world democracy, philosophy, and art. But it also gave the world a dangerous template, that a society can celebrate liberty while denying it to most. Rome adopted it. Later empires perfected it. And the modern world, in many ways, still struggles to break free from it. The legacy of Greece is not only marble columns and noble speeches, it is also the debt of chains, unpaid, remembered, and still demanding reckoning. Athens did not vanish with its fall to Macedon or Rome. Instead, it survived in something stranger: branding. The marble ruins, the speeches, the mythology of democracy, all polished, exported, and endlessly recycled. Athens became not a city of contradictions, but a logo, a symbol of liberty, even as its real history was built on chains. Athens as marketing. For centuries, rulers, revolutionaries, and empires have borrowed Athens to make themselves look legitimate. The French revolutionaries raised their own assemblies and praised the Greeks as their ancestors. The American founders built neoclassical buildings and filled their rhetoric with Athens-inspired ideals of citizenship and liberty. Yet the irony was loud. Both France and America practiced slavery at the same time. Athens was a brand that sold freedom, while its hidden fine print was slavery. The architecture of hypocrisy. Why are so many capitals, Washington, D.C., Paris, London, filled with Greek columns? Why do they look to Athens instead of to their own folk traditions? Because Athens had been turned into a universal certificate of legitimacy. A column meant, we are democratic. A temple facade meant, we represent the people. It didn't matter if the people excluded women, workers, or the enslaved. The facade did the work. Marble made hypocrisy look noble. The democracy starter pack. By the 19th century, every new republic wanted the Athenian aesthetic. The irony: Athens became shorthand for freedom, while the countries invoking it were often slaveholding or colonial powers. It was like a democracy starter pack sold wholesale. Columns for your buildings, speeches quoting Pericles' laws written in lofty language, and, if needed, slavery in the background. Athens as an export product. Freedom, tamam, with chains included. Athens in the classroom. The satire continues in education. Textbooks praise Athens for inventing democracy, a phrase repeated so often it feels carved in stone. Rarely do they add, and it invented this democracy on the backs of slaves. Instead, students grow up thinking Athens equals freedom, with no footnotes about who built the temples or mined the silver. Athens becomes a children's cartoon, noble citizens debating in white robes, the chains hidden off-screen. The ghost of Athens in modern politics. When modern leaders invoke the spirit of Athens, they mean freedom of speech, assemblies, and civic pride. But the ghost of Athens is whispering something else. Remember the slaves. Every time the people are invoked, the question lingers. Which people? Every time freedom is praised, the echo replies. Freedom for whom? Athens taught the world that liberty and exclusion could coexist. The modern world never quite unlearned that lesson. The satire of statues. Tourists today flock to Athens, stand before the Parthenon, and marvel at the birthplace of democracy. They take selfies, buy t-shirts, and sip coffee with the Acropolis in view. Few pause to ask, who cut those stones? Who carried them? Who sweated to lift them into place? The tragedy of Athens has been gentrified into a photo opportunity. The Parthenon is no longer a temple. It is a brand logo, the Nike swoosh of democracy, the debt that remains. The satire of Athens is that it sold the world, both ideals and illusions. It proved that human beings could govern themselves, but also proved how easily that governance could exclude, exploit, and erase. And because Athens became the brand of freedom, later societies copied not only its architecture, but also its blind spots. Modern democracies still struggle with inequality, exclusion, and exploitation. The fine print of Athens has not gone away. It has just been translated into modern forms. Closing narrative for Chapter 8. Athens lives on not just in ruins, but in rhetoric. Every parliament built with columns, every speech invoking the people, every textbook praising the first democracy is part of its long afterlife. But the real Athens, the Athens of slaves and silver mines, women excluded from politics, and citizens congratulating themselves on freedom while denying it to most, still haunts the brand. Athens sold democracy as an idea. History remembers it as a paradox. The world still lives in its shadow. History is a mirror, and Athens was not the only reflection. Rome, centuries later, built an even grander empire on the same paradox. Liberty for the few, slavery for the many. And beyond Rome, the pattern repeated in plantation economies, colonial empires, and even modern republics. The satire of Athens was not unique. It was a blueprint. Athens and Rome, two faces of the same coin. Athens called its citizens equal, but kept its economy powered by slaves in mines, workshops, and fields. Rome praised itself for its laws and citizenship, but filled its economy with war captives and chained labor. Athens, freedom as an exclusive club. Rome, freedom as a privilege purchased by conquest. Both systems taught the same lesson. Liberty shines brighter when it is contrasted against chains. The empire of scale. Rome industrialized what Athens pioneered. Where Athens counted slaves in the tens of thousands, Rome counted them in the millions. Entire provinces became supply chains of labor. Roman senators compared their estates by the number of slaves they owned, just as Athenians compared silver mined by enslaved hands. Both systems turned human lives into statistics. Both celebrated civilization, while running it like a business. The satire is sharp. The most admired civilizations of antiquity prided themselves on order and law, yet their order was built on permanent disorder for others. Echoes in the Atlantic world. Centuries later, the transatlantic slave trade repeated the same equation on a brutal new scale. Athens used slaves to mine silver. Plantations used slaves to grow sugar. Rome staged games with enslaved gladiators. Colonies staged punishments as public theater. Athens excluded women and workers from politics. Modern republics excluded them at the ballot box. The language changed. The costumes changed. But the structure remained. Freedom for the few, chains for the many. The rhetoric of hypocrisy. From Athens to Rome to the American South, elites used the same rhetorical trick. Slavery is natural. Aristotle wrote entire treatises about natural slaves. Roman jurists declared slaves were property, not people. Plantation owners in the Americas wrote sermons insisting God approved. The justification always arrived in elegant words, words that dressed up cruelty as reason. The irony. Civilizations famous for philosophy, law, and eloquence became masters at lying to themselves. The progress illusion. Athens claimed to invent democracy. Rome claimed to invent law. Modern nations claim to invent liberty, but all inherited the same blind spot. Progress that rests on invisible labor. Who mined the silver? Who plowed the fields? Who laid the bricks? Civilization congratulated itself for its ideas, while ignoring the hands that built its monuments. The progress was real, but it was purchased. The paradox of rebellion. Revolts haunted every empire. Spartacus in Rome, the Zanj in Iraq, the Maroons in the Caribbean, Nat Turner in Virginia. Each rebellion echoed Athens's hidden hypocrisy. When the excluded demanded freedom, they exposed the narrowness of the freedom celebrated above them. The satire of empire is that it never learned. Each believed itself eternal. Each ignored the cracks beneath its own marble. The legacy of comparison. Athens is often praised as unique, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and liberty. But its paradox was not unique. It was shared. It was copied. It was scaled. Rome perfected it. Europe exported it. Modern states sanitized it. The real Greek gift to the world was not just democracy. It was the model of how to sell freedom while hiding chains. Closing reflection for Chapter 9. Comparisons sharpen the satire. Athens wasn't an outlier, but a beginning. Rome extended it. Colonial empires globalized it. Modern nations still wrestle with it. The paradox of Athens is not ancient. It is alive. Every time a government invokes freedom while exploiting invisible labor, every time a parliament borrows Greek columns to hide inequality, the echo of Athens is present. Athens did not simply birth democracy. It birthed the template of democratic hypocrisy. And history keeps copying the design. Athens is gone. Its temples are ruins. Its philosophers reduced to schoolbook quotations. Its empire long since turned to dust. But its shadow still lingers. Not the shadow of Pericles' speeches or Aristotle's syllogisms, but the shadow of chains. The irony of Athens is not a relic. It is a living inheritance. The architecture of hypocrisy. Walk through Washington, London, or Paris, and you will see Athens reborn in stone. White marble columns, domes, pediments, all architectural imitations of the Parthenon. The buildings proclaim ideals, democracy, liberty, justice. Yet just as in Athens, the stones are silent about who laid them. They do not tell you about the enslaved in the colonies, the indentured in factories, or the migrants in fields. The look of democracy is eternal. The contradiction it conceals is equally eternal. Democracy's fragile foundations. Athens reminds us that democracy can be narrow. It can speak of liberty while drawing lines around who counts as free. In Athens, it was women, slaves, and foreigners who were excluded. In modern states, it has been indigenous peoples, black citizens, the poor, the undocumented. The mechanisms change, but the habit persists. Liberty for some, chains, visible or invisible, for others. The rhetoric of progress. Modern democracies love to compare themselves favorably to Athens. We are more inclusive, they say. We have learned. And yes, the franchise has expanded, rights have broadened, and voices once silenced are louder now. But Athens warns us not to confuse progress with completion. The same rhetoric of freedom can still coexist with new forms of bondage, mass incarceration, debt slavery, wage exploitation, surveillance. The costumes change. The satire does not. Athens is a warning, not a model. We are taught to admire Athens as a model. But perhaps Athens should be read as a warning. A democracy that excludes, that builds itself on invisible labor, that congratulates itself too quickly, risks collapsing into parody. Athens did not fall only because of Sparta's spears or Macedon's armies. It fell because its foundations were fragile, because its freedom was too thin to endure. The invisible chains today. Look closely, and you will see Athens in the modern world. Migrant workers building skyscrapers they will never live in. Laborers stitching clothes for democracies that debate their humanity. Gig workers carrying the burden of convenience without security. These are not chains of iron, but they are chains nonetheless. Athens whispers, "Beware the chains you do not see, because they too can break." The memory of resistance. Yet Athens also whispers something else. Even in its narrow democracy, the excluded dreamed wider. The enslaved resisted, women spoke in private salons, foreigners traded ideas that reached philosophers' ears. And later generations, Romans, revolutionaries, abolitionists, turned the satire of Athens into a call to do better. The irony of Athens has been both a curse and a catalyst. It shows us hypocrisy, but it also gives us language to fight hypocrisy. The final satire, here is the bitter comedy. The same world that reveres Athens for democracy should also remember Athens for slavery. The two are inseparable. The marble of liberty was mortared with chains. But here is the hopeful irony. Knowing this frees us. If we see Athens clearly, not as a model, but as a contradiction, then we can refuse to repeat it. Closing reflection. The shadow of Athens is long, but shadows only exist because light exists too. The task of modern democracy is not to imitate Athens, but to surpass it, to turn satire into sincerity, to widen the circle of liberty until no one is outside it. Athens may have built democracy on chains, but our lesson is simple. The debt of chains must not be repeated. Athens gave the world two legacies, the language of freedom and the silence of slavery. Which one we choose to carry forward is up to us.